Welcome back to science class. My name is Ms. Rillieux, and this week we will be discussing plant and animal life cycles. If you joined me last week, we finished our series on physical properties, and the last thing we discussed was the difference between insulators and conductors. So before we move into this week's session on life cycles, let's review what we did last week. So to review what we did last week, we're going to play Jeopardy! And again, this Jeopardy! Is going to review our session on conductors and insulators. So if you have your notes from last week, please grab them. So starting with number 1, we have 5 columns: in your home, at school, outside, on the street, or in a store. Starting with 100, in your home. Your teddy bear, is it an insulator or is it a conductor? If you answered that your teddy bear is an insulator, you are correct. In your home for 200, your mother's china plates. Are they insulators or conductors? Correct again. China plates would be an insulator. In your home for 300, your bicycle. Is it an insulator or is it a conductor? Correct. It could be both, just depending on the part of the bike that we're talking about. In your home for 400, a grandfathered clock. Would that be considered an insulator or a conductor? Yes, a grandfather clock would be considered both. Again, depending on the part of the clock that we're talking about. And then last one for in your home, your piggy bank. Would your piggy bank be considered an insulator or a conductor? Yes, your piggy bank is both. Moving on to at school. So starting with at school for 100, your pencil. Is your pencil an insulator or is your pencil a conductor? Yes, your pencil is both. 200, staples. Would staples be considered a conductor, an insulator, or both? Absolutely. Staples are definitely considered a conductor because of what they are made from. At your school for 300, your scissors. Would your scissors be considered an insulator, a conductor, or both? Correct again. Scissors would be both. And again, it's depending on the part of the scissors. Now remember, scissors are made up of different components that are made up of different materials. And whenever we're determining if something is an insulator or a conductor, we have to look at the material. So if we are looking at the rubber plastic part of the scissor, then that would be an insulator. But if we're looking at this metal end would be more of a conductor. So whenever you're deciding if something is an insulator or if you're deciding if something's conductor, you have to look at the material that makes up that object. And some objects are made up of multiple materials, and that's why we can answer that the answer is both. It's a conductor and an insulator, just depends on the part of the object that you are identifying. 400, your crayons. Are your crayons an example of a conductor or an insulator? Great job. Your crayons are definitely considered an insulator. Now, how about at your school for 500? Last one. The globe in your classroom. Is the globe in your classroom considered an insulator, a conductor, or both? Correct again. The globe in your classroom is considered both. Again, that's because the globe is made up of multiple different or several different materials. And depending on the part of the globe that we are discussing, that determines whether that part would be a conductor or insulator, which means that a globe itself, if we're talking about the entire system, it is considered both. Moving on to outside for 100, a log. Would a log be considered an insulator, a conductor, or both? Yes, a log is considered an insulator. Outside for 200, sand. Is sand a conductor or an insulator? Or how about both? Absolutely. Sand is definitely an insulator. Outside for 300, a cockroach. Would a cockroach be considered an insulator, a conductor, or both? Yes, a cockroach would be considered a conductor. 400, ice. Is ice considered a insulator, a conductor, or both? Correct. Ice would be considered an insulator. All right, so now we're going to move to the column titled On the Street. And so for 100 on the street, the sidewalk. Would the sidewalk be considered an insulator, a conductor, or both? Yes, the sidewalk would be considered an insulator. On the street for 200, a stop sign. Would a stop sign be considered a conductor, an insulator, or both? Great job. A stop sign definitely would be considered a conductor. On the street for 300, a billboard. Would a billboard be considered a conductor, insulator, or both? Yes, a billboard is an example of an insulator. On the street for 400, a fire hydrant. Would a fire hydrant be considered a conductor, an insulator, or both? Absolutely. A fire hydrant is a conductor. And then on the street for 500, a lamppost. Would a lamppost be considered a conductor, an insulator, or both? Yes, a lamppost is both. I'm going to go back to my third column outside. I just noticed I forgot the 500 question, and we want to make sure we get to that one before we go to our last column. So outside for 500, a beehive. Is a beehive an example of a conductor, an insulator, or both? Correct. A beehive is an example of a insulator. Very good. And so now we're down to our last column in the store. And so 100, a soda can. Is a soda can an example of a conductor, an insulator, or both? Great job. A soda can is 100% a conductor. In store for 200, a water bottle. Is a water bottle an example of a conductor, an insulator, or both? Yes, a water bottle would be an example of both. In store for 300, a souvenir keychain. Is a souvenir keychain an example of an insulator, a conductor, or both? Yes, it is both. In store for 400, a bubblegum dispenser. Is a bubblegum dispenser an example of an insulator, a conductor, or both? Correct again. A bubblegum dispenser is definitely an example of both. And then last but not least, 500 in store, a shopping cart. Is a shopping cart an example of a conductor, an insulator, or both? Both. A shopping cart would be most similar to scissors. It has a rubber part that would be representing the insulator, and then a metal area, which would be representing the conductor. So again, when we're trying to decide if something is a conductor, an insulator, or both, we have to look at the material that the object is made up of. All right. So now that we have reviewed what we did last week, let's get into this week's session on life cycles. So the focus is students will be able to investigate and compare how animals and plants undergo a series of orderly changes in their diverse life cycles, such as tomato plants, frogs, and ladybugs. The question I have for you today, how do organisms compare as they go through their life cycles? So the agenda, the first thing we're going to do is create a life cycles foldable, guided practice, complete a life cycle sort, independent practice, quiz is, and then last but not least, some STAR practice questions to get us ready for the STAR assessment if we're taking an online version later on this couple months. Materials you will need for this session include just paper, pencil, and scissors. And the first thing we're going to learn today is, what is a life cycle? And so once we understand what a life cycle is, we'll then describe how all living things are born, grow, have young, and then die. And then for number 3, we'll understand that there are different ways which these events can happen. So let's get started. The first thing is, what is a life cycle? So animal life cycle, all changes a living thing goes through during its life. We have life cycles, animals have life cycles, insects have life cycles. Anything that has life or is representing life has a life cycle. And that's just the changes that an object goes through or an organism goes through throughout the years or months or days. It just depends on the organism. So this is an example of a life cycle of a frog. So frogs start off as eggs and then tadpoles, a froglet, and an adult frog. And again, humans have life cycles just like a frog has a life cycle. Now, this is an example of a plant life cycle. So the plant starts off as a seed, and then a seedling, then a vine, a flower, and then a green pumpkin, and then an orange pumpkin. So this would be one example of a plant life cycle. And the key here is to know that this is just representing the change. The orange pumpkin just didn't appear out of nowhere. The orange pumpkin went through a set of life stages in order to become an orange pumpkin. Orange pumpkins do not just appear, just like if we're talking about frogs. Frogs just do not appear. Frogs go through a set of changes in order to become what we know as a frog. They start off as an egg and then progress until they are a frog. So a life cycle is a set of changes. And that's what we want to understand, that these steps are changes that an individual or an organism goes through throughout its lifetime. So stage 1 is always going to be birth. So being born is the start of new life. And so that's how we all got here, is through birth. And that's how frogs get here, how other organisms get here, is all through birth. And the second one is growing up. So once you're born, you grow up. As you can see, this bear example is starting small until larger. Same thing with you and I. We start off as babies and then toddlers and then kids and then teens and then adults. So you grow up, you get bigger in size. Now, development. All right. So while you're getting bigger, you're also developing. So you're growing, you're learning, and you're improving. So butterflies are an excellent example of how an organism not only gets bigger and grows, but it also develops over time. But regardless if we're talking about growing bigger or developing over time, the one thing that they both have in common is change. So as you develop, you change. As you grow, you change. And again, that's what we want to take away from this week's session, is that a life cycle is all about the changes that an organism goes throughout its lifetime. So as we can see from this butterfly example, the caterpillar or the butterfly starts off as eggs, and then it goes to a caterpillar, then its cocoon phase, and then a butterfly. Now, reproduction. So in order for all of this to happen, reproduction must happen. So living things such as animals and plants, they create young, or what we also known as offspring. So animals, including me and you, humans, create babies, while plants create seeds. But regardless if you're creating babies or you're creating seeds, you are reproducing, and you are reproducing in order for an organism to go through its life stages. Now, once you've gone through your life stage, if birth is number 1, then death is always last. So this is when life is over for an organism. As you can see in our example on the screen, this is the example of life being over for the flower when it dies. But same thing happens to your cat, your dog, and even you and I. So death is always the end. Birth is always the beginning. So what is an organism? We've discussed this before. An organism is any living thing. It can either be an animal or a plant that's alive. And so how do we know something is an organism? Yes, what we've learned is that if something is an organism, it must have a cell, at least one. If it has one cell, it's a unicellular organism. If it has more than one cell, it's a multicellular organism. But regardless if it's unicellular having one cell or multicellular having several cells or thousands of cells or millions of cells, it's still living as long as it just has one. So examples of organisms might be a snake, a pumpkin is an organism, or a rabbit. So essential vocabulary that we want to take away from this week's session. Number one, a life cycle. So we definitely need to know that a life cycle is the stages of a plant or animal goes through from an egg to adult. And what we want to remember about that is that this life cycle is a set of changes. So changing from an egg to a caterpillar, changing from a seed to a seedling, whatever it may be. But a life cycle is a set of changes represented by stages. Now, metamorphosis is the process of change during the life cycle. And again, think about those Power Rangers. They morphed. And so whenever we see the word morph, we want to think about, again, the word change. So it's a process of change. Now, simple metamorphosis is the process of change during a life cycle where the young resembles the adult. And that's why it's simple, because the young looks like an adult. There's not that many changes. And keyword simple. But complete metamorphosis, the young does not look like the adult. So there are multiple stages, and the young, they look very different from the adult. On the other hand, simple metamorphosis, the young and adult kind of look similar, and there's not that many stages. So in complete metamorphosis, we can expect more changes. So life cycle stages that you typically see for various organisms include birth, always as number one, growth and change, maturity, so we're growing and we're developing, and then last but not least, death. So this is an example of a 3-phase insect life cycle. So we see starts off as an egg, and then a nymph, and then an adult. And so this, at every stage, there is a change. Now, as we can see from this one, the change from nymph to adult is not that great. So this would be considered a simple metamorphosis, because one, there's not that many stages. Two, the young looks very similar to the adult. But this is an example. Although they look similar, this is still a change. And because there is a change, there are stages, we consider this a life cycle of an insect. And so other animals or other insects that go through a simple metamorphosis would be a cockroach, a grasshopper, and a dragonfly. And what we want to take away from simple metamorphosis is not that they don't change, it's that the change is not largely seen. So the young look very similar to the adult. Now, the second set of life cycle that we're going to look at is a 4-phase insect life cycle. So an additional stage has been added. And again, we start off with an egg, larva, pupal, and then adult. Now, what you want to notice is the difference between the 4-stage and the 3-stage is that the adult and the young, they look very different. As we can see, that adult has wings, it has bright colors, but our larva and our pupal, our young, they look very different. So we know that this is not simple metamorphics because our young does not look like our adult. And because our young does not look like our adult, we know that this is complete metamorphosis. There is an additional stage, the change, you can see it, it's greater. And so insects that go through complete metamorphosis is beetles, butterflies, flies, ants, and fleas. So these organisms, they look vastly different from their young to adult stage. So there is a complete change occurring within those stages. Additional stages have also been included in contrast to the simple metamorphosis. But again, the biggest takeaways that we want to take away from this session are these essential vocabulary. First, we need to know a life cycle. Whenever we see that word, we want to think about changes. And life cycles occur in all organisms, unicellular organisms, multicellular organisms, animals, plants, life cycles occur. We also want to know that the basis around this is that throughout each stage, there is going to be a change. Sometimes that change is not very great, so we call that simple metamorphosis, but sometimes the change from one stage to another is great, and we would call that complete metamorphosis. All right, so now that we know what a life cycle is, we've seen some examples, we're going to sort a couple life cycles. The first one that we're going to sort is for a butterfly. So we're going to start with stage number 1. Now remember, whenever we're talking about life stages, we all kind of start the same. Do you remember where we all start? Yes, we all start at birth. And so for a butterfly, that is going to be the egg stage. All right, so now that we have our egg stage, our birth, what do you believe is going to, or what picture on here is going to represent the second stage of the butterfly? Would it be the butterfly? Would it be the caterpillar, the cocoon, or the butterfly coming out of the cocoon? What would be number 2? Yes, number 2 in this section would be, or on this diagram would be the the caterpillar. All right, so we have our egg, and then we change to our next stage, which is our caterpillar stage. And so now that we have our second stage identified, let's identify our third stage. So would our third stage be the butterfly coming out the cocoon, or the cocoon? Right, absolutely. The next stage in this diagram would be our cocoon. And this again is a change. So we started off at birth in our eggs, and then we changed to our second stage as a caterpillar, and then we changed to our third stage, which was the cocoon stage. So now that we're in the cocoon stage, what would be our next stage after that? Would it be coming out of the cocoon, or would it be the butterfly stage? Right. The next stage would definitely be coming out of the cocoon in this diagram. And so again, starting from the beginning, we started at birth as eggs, and then we changed to our second stage, which is the caterpillar. We changed to our third stage, which is the cocoon. We changed to our fourth stage, which is coming out of the cocoon, which would mean that our last stage is the butterfly stage. Now, see, this would be an example of a complete metamorphosis, because as you can see, our young look very different from our adult. A caterpillar looks very different from a butterfly. In fact, a lot of people say that that's kind of weird, that you start off with a caterpillar and then you end up with this beautiful creature called a butterfly. But this is an example of a complete metamorphosis, where the caterpillar, looks very different from the adult, the butterfly. But regardless, if we're talking about a simple metamorphosis or we're talking about a complete metamorphosis like the butterfly life cycle, there is a change that occurs at each stage. So we change from the egg to the caterpillar to the cocoon to coming out of the cocoon to ending up as a beautiful butterfly. So now that we have identified the butterfly life cycle correctly, let's look at a plant, because remember, life cycles are not constricted just to animals. They also occur in plants. Remember, life cycles occur in any organism that is living. So in order to be living, you must have a cell. So if you have a cell, you undergo a life cycle, sometimes very small and short, sometimes very long and different. But it just depends on the organism. But again, all organisms, which means they're living, they go through or undergo life cycles. So let's start with the plant. And so if we're looking at the plant, we have 5 pictures and we're going to identify the cycle. So starting with number 1 would be the seed. Now remember, the difference between a plant's life cycle and an animal life cycle is that plants' life cycles start with seed. That would be considered their birth. And then animal life cycles typically start from the majority of animals at the egg stage. So now that we have our seed, let's go to our next stage. All right, so germination would be our next stage. An example of that would be this image here. All right, so we started off, stage 1 is a seed, and then we changed to stage 2, which is germination, and we look a little bit different. Now, moving on to the third stage, which is seedling. And so an example of that would be this image here. And so again, as you can see, just like an organism, like the butterfly, plants also undergo stages and they change for every stage. So seed, germination, seedling. All right. So now we're moving on to our fourth stage, which is a young adult. And that would be this. And it's a little small, so I'll make it a little bit bigger for you. Make all these a little bit bigger, just so you can see the differences a little bit better. All right, so we start off at stage 1, moved on to stage 2, a change. We changed, moving to stage 3, and then we changed again, moving to stage 4. And then our last stage would be the adult plant. All right, so this is an example of a life cycle for a plant. But what we want to take away again is we're talking about life cycles. We're talking about changes occurring within the different stages of an organism. That organism can either be represented by a plant or an animal. All right, so we're going to practice a few questions on a quiz is, and then move on to our exit ticket. So number 1, what is the first stage of a life cycle for a butterfly? Yes, the first stage of a life cycle for a butterfly is egg. Number 2, how are frog and butterfly life cycles the same? Yes, the way that they're both the same is they both start off in that egg stage. How many stages does a butterfly life cycle have? Correct. A butterfly life cycle has 4 stages. Select the order of a frog life cycle. Correct. It would be the egg, tadpole, froglet, and then frog. Stages in an insect's life cycle after it hatches from the egg. Yes, an insect would go into the larva stage. All right, so now let's practice some star practice questions. All right, question number 1. Lacewings are insects that hatch from eggs. Which of the following correctly compares lacewing life cycle with the frog life cycle? So A, adult lacewings lay eggs, but adult frogs give birth to live larvae. B, when they hatch, young lacewings and young frogs look different from their adult forms. C, when they hatch, both lacewings and frogs have long legs. Or D, both adult lacewings and adult frogs have more legs than they had as larvae. So the first thing we want to do is understand what the question is asking us. So we want to find the choice that is correct, the true choice. So now that you know that you're looking for the true choice, can you tell me what answer is correct? Yes, so the answer to this question is B. So the thing that lacewings and frogs have in common is that they both go through a complete metamorphosis, where their young look very different from their adult life stage. And then answer is B. And our last question, the abalone is a type of sea snail. Adult abalones slowly crawl over rocks near the shore, while larvae floating in the water. Which organism has a life cycle that is most likely like that of an abalone? So first thing you need to ask yourself is, this is its life cycle: adult, egg, larva, juvenile. And so what organism did we discuss today that would most likely go from the egg to the larva to the juvenile? And our choices are F humans, G frogs, H birds, and J snakes. Correct. The answer to this question is G frogs. That is everything I have for you today. Thank you for joining me. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.